Reactive ground tracking. It's perhaps the most straightforward tracking scenario type, but at the same time, the most difficult. We've seen players at the top of ground tracking come and go. Do you know Do, Honor, Demotori, however you say this guy's name, Clover, AOD, they all hold really insane ground tracking scores and remain at the top of the tracking leaderboards in Kovacs. But they all generally share the same technique. Fast reactions, low tension, minimal to no predicting at all. It's the usual best practices and the same appearances. But like, what is this? This is Hizku. He's a newer aim trainer and consistently holds top scores in ground tracking scenarios in Kovacs and aim labs. Today, we're going to try and break down his very weird technique, which we will refer to as diagonalmaxxing.
Diagonally.
This trick will only work on ground tracking scenarios, like strafe track or pill track in aim labs, and ground plaza scenarios in Kovacs. Specifically, your target needs to be a pill, moving only horizontally on the same level as the player, ground level. The earliest time we can see this method in use by Hizku is the first video on his channel, a VOD of Pat Strafe Advanced. We can use this as a starting point to describe how good Hizku is at ground tracking and to introduce the technique. Let's get the fundamentals out of the way. Hizku is very quick and smooth with his reactions. They don't stutter due to excessive speeds or lag behind due to inefficient reading. At the core, he's genuinely as strong of a reactive player as any other top tracker. I'd like to emphasize Hizku's smoothness for this introduction. At times it mirrors Scucchi's raw smoothness, but in the category of reactive. This makes edge tracking a lot easier to pull off. We've already seen edge tracking in a previous Aim Secrets episode, but we will go over it again today, since it is important to understanding the functional purpose of diagonalmaxxing. Edge tracking is the application of under-aiming in aim training for the purpose of maximizing time on target. It means to intentionally place one's crosshair on the following edge of a target when tracking it, so when it eventually switches its direction of motion, the target will pass through the crosshair. This gives us extra time to react to the direction change, time during which we will remain on target. It is a highly skilled implementation of smooth pivots in reactivity and exhibits fine control of one's tension. Edge tracking is essential to higher scoring in most Kovac reactive scenarios. What do I mean when I say it's an application of under-aiming? Well, to edge track properly, you need to have generally smooth tracking, but specifically you need to withhold your tension in a way that you are not over-pronouncing your own movements. You need to ensure that when you pivot on the bot's direction change, you are not over-flicking or crossing fully over to the forward edge of the target, aka no longer edge tracking. Extremely skilled ground tracking players, like Clover or Demotori, have such strong command over their tension utilization that they're able to keep their pivots extremely fast and reactive without overcompensating. It is the vital quality of their tracking skill that distinguishes them from the rest. But we're not Clover or Demotori. What can we mortals do to reach that kind of smooth reactivity without needing to overtense or run into stability issues? Now let's do a full overview of diagonalmaxxing. Again, this only truly works on ground tracking scenarios, so we will have a cylindrical pill bot to show this concept. Let's assume that this bot is moving to the left on our screen here. Here, if we place our crosshair on the right, the following edge, we are edge tracking the target. This shows the effectiveness of edge tracking. When the target changes direction, moving to the right, it will pass through our crosshair. The blue arrow still shows that our movement is towards the left, but because we get the extra time on target, we do not lose score during our reaction pivot. So this is all great, right? But in ground tracking, it can be even better. Recall that good reactive tracking comes with an understanding of how to transfer tension across all parts of our arm, specifically our forearm, wrist, and fingertips. Each of these components offers different advantages in mobility. But in this discussion, we're going to compare and contrast the aiming functions of the forearm and the wrist. When we use our arm, it's usually for much wider motions, covering more distance. It's also for stabilizing fast reactions to fast target movements. Pretty much anything wide, fast, and explosive. Hence why we prioritize flicking with our arm to have rigid, snappy movements when needed. In contrast, the wrist is far more efficient for narrow micro motions, such as when the target is short strafing. It's also preferred to be used when prioritizing smooth tracking in these sequences. It's worth considering anatomically how the wrist bends when we are aiming. When we ulnar deviate fully, using only tension in our wrist, we will naturally aim down. When we radially deviate fully, again using only tension in our wrist, we naturally aim up. You can try this yourself. Open MS Paint, center your mouse cursor, lock your fingers and your arm so that you only move your wrist, and bend your wrist naturally. You may notice that the lines you draw are not perfectly horizontally straight, not even close. This is what happens when we let our mouse naturally follow the directions that our wrist allows us to move. This subtle drifting is the reason why diagonalmaxxing may feel more natural and instinctive than trying to force a perfectly straight, perfectly horizontal line. If the technique feels more natural, that's a good start. But what exactly makes trying to use the wrist overall more effective? Let's return to the previous example, when our bot is moving left. Here, we are adding a new purple arrow that represents the potential overflick distance on our reaction. Overflicking is detrimental to reactive tracking, since we lose so much time on target, and it causes us to lose perception of the current bot motion by forcing us to adjust back. It's the reason why flicking is bad compared to smoothly micro-adjusting in most air scenarios, because it can lead to situations like this. Now, the target switches its movement direction to the right just as before. The player must react and pivot their own motion. Note that the movement indicated by the blue arrow is the ideal. It represents the most correct and precise execution of the reaction. The purple arrow indicates the potential for error, which we want to minimize the length of. The purple bar on the right side shows us the maximum potential overflick distance. The farther away this bar is from the opposite side of the target, the worse the error potential. We can assume that this bot is moving pretty quickly, and the player is currently trying to use their arm to help the movement be horizontal. Now, let's look at the alternate technique. This example shows what would happen if the player was diagonalmaxxing. The crosshair is lower to reflect the technique, and this time the player motion and potential overflick distance are directed downwards, diagonally. First, notice how the potential error bar is much closer to the target now, indicating that the risk of losing score due to the overpronunciation of the pivot is reduced. Now, I know some people in the comments will be like, Maddie, why would the arrow not be of the same length and therefore the overflick will travel the same distance, and especially if you're pivoting at a 45-degree angle? Well, remember what we discussed just before this. The arm is used for wide motions, and the wrist for narrow motions. If we try to use the arm for more narrow short strafes and situations that require a lot of under-aiming, we would overflick or exaggerate our pivots a lot more, which we don't want. It's the same logic behind why we should react to Fugla XYZ blink smoothly instead of with our arm. There's a higher risk of us losing control with an arm flick. The potential distance here is shorter because we're trying to use only our wrist. Here, in the opposite movement direction, we let the mouse drift upwards, following what we described earlier with how the wrist naturally bends. Now, I'm aware that there are players who do not follow these same directions. If we look at some of Oka's VODs, he can be seen tracking up when moving right and tracking down when moving left, which is the reverse of Hizku's diagonalmaxxing. It's worth noting that the directions do not matter as much as letting your wrist do the work naturally, and moving diagonally in the process. As long as those two aspects are in play, you should reap some of the benefits. The question, of course, is, does this work? More specifically, can it work for everyone? Why dive so deep into an aiming technique that is so niche if it doesn't bring us a higher score? Well, that's the funny thing. It absolutely does. I don't always do it, but for most ground tracking scenarios, I find myself naturally falling into the habit because it feels better to me. It helps me to be more smooth in situations where I would be a lot more shaky. I've been doing it since the middle of 2023, when Hizku first started posting. I even did it at the Rebel Ready check with Veer Track. It's not as visible, but it's still there. As for the question of, can everybody do it? It's a little bit more difficult to answer. This is a high-level technique, and people who don't already have a foundational understanding of reactive tracking won't see the same benefits as those who do. Though I could be wrong, and maybe this is the breakthrough that you're looking for even if you're not as advanced, let me know in the comments if this is so. I should also note that if your experience testing this technique is not the same as how we've described, and diagonal maxing actually feels unnatural to you, you shouldn't try to force it. This technique is what feels right for Hizku, and what makes tracking easier for him. Don't overthink it. And don't feel pressured to adopt his technique just because we're showing it off here as being good. Once again, it mostly comes down to personal preference. With all of that said, I know a lot of you watching this video are ready to ask one question. Does this help in games? Well, let's try it. Hold on, let me diagonal max this good.
There's a bird on me.
Just run away. Twitch Turbo.
It's like how you actually get It's like Twitch Prime, but the next hero.
Dude, no way! It's not a good thing! It's not good, bro! It's not good!
Played your game.
Oh, you should.
Did you send it again later? Or pin it in
Oh, he's
chat?
getting so much heals!
Okay.
Oh!
Oh no. Yeah.
I got slapped!
No, I didn't Ajax. I was trying to die mid B.
I didn't Ajax, I just Ajax diagonally.
Ajax.
Unfortunately, probably not. So it is just a score farming technique specific to aim trainers, and maybe helps in games that don't have headshots. But I still don't think that it's worth tossing out the window. A lot of criticism against aim trainers comes due to the fact that hitboxes in aim trainers are unrealistic. They're just pills, they don't have heads, so why would they help you to shoot people in games where headshots count more? The problem that I have with this criticism is that it downplays the capacity of human beings to adapt. We are versatile, and the more knowledge we have, the more we can change and shift our technique to help us. Yes, hitboxes are different, but we will train our aim to a point where it doesn't matter what the target looks like, or where the head is. We will track the target all the same, because literally, it's the thought that counts. So, indeed, these are tactics that, when all put together in the aim trainer, may help you to get a better score. But for in-game improvement, remember that these concepts of under-aiming, tension control, and the natural motions of the wrist are still absolutely critical to proper aiming mechanics. This has been the weird tracking method of Hizku FPS. I hope you guys learned something useful. Have fun experimenting with diagonal maxing in your own ground tracking training. I'll see you guys in the next episode or aim training VOD. Check out my streams at twitch.tv/MattyOW where I play Overwatch and do aim training VOD reviews. As always, happy dot clicking.